And oh, look at you, like a champ. Okay. So we're now recording. Thank you. So today's meeting is with Nathan Kalmoe and Lilliana Mason, authors of Radical American Partisanship, Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes and the Consequences for Democracy. This book was reviewed in the spring 2023 edition of Public Opinion Quarterly. Thanks so much for joining us, Nathan and Lilliana. I'm Melissa Sedate. I'm your host for this session. The Book Club 2.0 series is brought to you by your DC-AAPOR program committee. For those who are unfamiliar with the series, the format is pretty simple. First, the authors present on background about the book, including highlights and insights. During this part, please mute your microphones and use the chat feature in Zoom to enter any thoughts or questions. Then we'll open up the floor for discussion, starting with items in the chat box and then more generally. If you're comfortable at that time, please feel free to turn on your camera and ask your question or provide feedback directly. You're also invited to contribute reactions and comments to each other, as this is a discussion and not just a Q&A session. At the end of the hour, as the incoming DC-AAPOR program chair, I'll announce the name of the DC-AAPOR member who's won a copy of today's book, and we'll all celebrate. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests. Nathan Kalmoe is Executive Director of the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. He's written 3 scholarly books, 24 academic articles, and many public essays on contentious politics and democratization, with particular focus on partisanship, violence, identity, ideology, and messaging effects to inform national discussions. His research on mass politics integrates political science, communications, psychology, and history with a wide range of social science methods. Kalmoe's work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and other popular outlets. Lilliana Mason is SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. She's the co-author of Radical American Partisanship and the author of Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity. Her research combines the fields of social psychology, sociology, and political science to examine American political behavior. Her work on partisan identity, partisan bias, and social sorting, and American attitudes towards political violence has been published in journals such as the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, Public Opinion Quarterly, and Political Behavior, and featured in media outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and National Public Radio. And with that, I will hand it over to our guests. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting us today. Super happy to be here. I'm gonna go first, and then Nathan is going to go second. Okay. So this is just the title. This is who we are and where we are. I want to give you a short kind of intro to how we got started on this project. We were both at ISPP, the International Society of Political Psychology Conference in Edinburgh in 2017. At the time, we were both working on books that had not yet been published. And these are the 2 books. Nathan was working on a book looking at the role of partisanship in sort of organizing and shaping violence during the American Civil War. And I was working on Uncivil Agreement, which looks at how basically there are the social dynamics of how Republicans and Democrats in the United States hate each other. But one thing that we noticed was that while Nathan was looking at true, like actual terrifying levels of violence, murder and killing and death, the most extreme question that I was asking in my book about contemporary American politics was, how would you feel if your child married somebody from the other party? And so it seemed to us like there was a large gap between the possibility of partisanship motivating real violence and this sort of like relatively mild question about how would you feel if a person from the other party moved in next door? So it occurred to us that we really weren't measuring the potential for there existing already extreme attitudes in the American public, and no one was really asking those questions. So we decided to do this project, which ultimately turned into the book. Essentially, what we're doing is trying to at the very least, just understand to how far American animosity towards partisan opponents can go. Is it, are Americans at a level where we could have real violence break out? Or are we just not thinking in that way, right? Do Americans not really think about violence when they think about politics? And how can we try to assess what is the current state of American attitudes about political violence? And one of the big puzzles that we noticed in prior research is that the American voter is kind of like the Bible of American political behavior, right? We all have to read it to understand how partisanship works, how Americans think about politics. And it was published in 1960 based on data from the 1950s, which was a time when the parties were really not very different from each other. And even the American Political Science Association, put out this report saying like they need to be more different so people can have a choice. Nobody knows the difference between the parties. And so when they were developing their theories of American partisanship, what they were observing was a very mild form of partisanship in which the divides between Republicans and Democrats just weren't very intense or very deep. So this is in the 1950s, these scholars were basically saying partisanship it's an identity, it can shape the way that we view the world, but it's relatively harmless. At the same time, though, social psychologists in Europe were coming out of World War II, and they were really interested in how can groups hate each other so much, social groups hate each other so much that we can end up with something like World War II and the Holocaust. And these scholars were working at the same time. And so the social psychologists were blaring out warnings about how identity can really motivate just terrifying forms of violence. And American political scientists were sort of saying like, well, partisanship is an identity, but it's fine. So that was kind of the puzzle that we were looking into. Not exactly a puzzle, but sort of like these two things existed at the same time, and they've shaped very different views of how we should think about partisanship and identity and conflict in American politics. So we decided to start asking just questions that no one was asking, and we used theories from intergroup conflict to say, like Albert Bandura's work on moral disengagement, which basically says the way that you inflict harm upon an entire group of people is that you first have to distance yourself from them as humans. You have to think of them as an actual violent threat to you. And then when you harm them, you don't feel like you're a morally bad person. So it's like a permission slip for humans to harm other humans. And so we developed these questions coming right out of the Bandura moral disengagement work. And so these questions were the party was piped in with the survey software. So would you say opposing party are a serious threat to the United States and its people? They're not just worse for politics, they're downright evil. And so those first two are vilification. And then the third, many lack the traits to be considered fully human. They behave like animals. That's the dehumanization question. So I'll just say, to start off, this was in 2017, we didn't have a strong idea about what we were going to find, right? Like it's possible at this point that people are really just like not willing to call people from the other party evil. Recall that we were in the beginning of the Trump administration, so things felt pretty dicey at the time, but we just didn't know what to expect. And so for the book, and also I'm showing you like the things that happened after the book came out, but basically for the book, we started measuring this in 2017. And then we kept collecting more data. So each of these dots is a survey that was collected by YouGov and weighted to be representative of the US Census on a variety of demographics. So what we ended up seeing in 2017 was pretty high levels of threatening, considering the other party to be a threat, around 60% of Democrats and Republicans. That increased during the time that we were measuring this, although it did seem to calm down a little bit after during the Biden administration in terms of threatening attitudes. Thinking of the other party as evil started around 40% in 2017 and escalated throughout the period that we were studying. Again, we see a slight decline at in 2022. And then dehumanization, this is the one that we were really worried about. You know, around 20% in 2017 were willing to say to dehumanize people in the other party, and that shifts over time, you know, gradually increasing also. So we were not heartened by these numbers. This is not you know, we were really hoping that most of them would be pretty low, and instead found that these are pretty prevalent attitudes in the US. Sorry. And then we also just asked explicitly about attitudes about political violence. So when is it okay for your party to send threatening and intimidating messages to the leaders for people from your party, to send intimidating messages to the other party's leaders? When is it okay to harass an ordinary person in a way that makes them feel frightened? And then just explicitly, how much do you feel it's justified for your party to use violence in advancing their political goals these days? And you know, there are many more questions, and I'll show you some more, you know, different versions of these questions. But just for tracking across time, again, we found definitely, you know, some of our lowest measurements in the very beginning. And then what you'll note in terms of threats is that attitudes about threats seem to respond to real life events. So both of the peaks that we see here are around the first and second impeachment of Donald Trump. Second impeachment also being insurrection. And so it does seem like there are, you know, these threatening attitudes are somewhat responsive to things that are happening in the country. Overall acceptance of violence, the trend that we note here is that actually it seems like the party that's not in power is more approving of violence, which tends to make sense, although these differences are barely significant if they are at all. It tends to make sense when you think of violence as a disruptive force, and people who are in power generally prefer the status quo because they want to stay in power. But again, these are numbers that, you know, you know, are around, get up to 20 to 30%. At the lowest, they're you know, 5%, but we do see change, and we do see significant numbers during certain periods of time of people approving of violence. We also wanted to know what people were thinking when they said that they approved of violence. So this was a follow-up question that was actually, it was a follow-up question where basically we asked people about their, you know, what were you thinking? So, and that included these basic categories of widespread violence by armed groups that kills lots of people at the most extreme end, and then, you know, sort of descending in severity with fist fights or killing a couple people, fist fights, destroying property, harassment, and then something else that we didn't have in the list. And then people who just sort of backed off once we asked the detailed question and said none. And so we do see some partisan differences here. You know, our lowest approval seems to be with things like, you know, harming other people or killing other people. Democrats tend to be much more supportive of things like destruction of property. Usually that's in the form of like a protest. They're somewhat similar in their approval of violence that might kill a few people, verbal insults and harassment. Republicans are thinking about something else. And one thing I'll note here is one thing we did not include in this list was assassination. So it is possible that the something else might have included something like that. But we don't know for that. But it does seem like there's a pretty wide variety of things that people are thinking about when they answer this question. We also ask about when it might be okay to engage, whether violence would be acceptable under certain conditions. So if, you know, free and fair elections are no longer happening, if people's votes are counted or people's, you know, different votes are counted differently, if there's issue attitudes on abortion, guns, if our rulers are not following the law, there's discrimination. So, you know, as we see throughout most of our data, the vast majority of people say never, but but it really does seem to change depending on the political context. So we have, significantly lower numbers of people saying it's never acceptable when we have, situations in which, the government is imprisoning people who criticize them, the government is corrupt, there's racial or religious discrimination, the rulers are not obeying the law. So this also indicates that violence, the approval of violence seems to be dependent on what is happening in our politics at that time. We wanted to look into, using these data, we wanted to look into what are the things associated with these violent attitudes? How do we predict what types of people are going to be approving of violence? And what we found consistently across all of our studies is that the strength of people's partisan identity, so that means like using a social identity scale, including when I talk about, Democrats or Republicans, I say we rather than they. That social identification with the party is significantly associated with approval of violence in basically every study. But also, and we think this is sort of a validating finding, just basic aggressiveness, like a trait aggression. So like, have you ever hit somebody? Do you get angry easily? That's also a very consistent predictor of these violent attitudes, and suggesting that there is something about violence inherent in people's answers to these questions. We also found that there is a relationship between that moral disengagement scale, the moral disengagement items, and violent attitudes. Sorry, violent attitudes, but it's dependent upon aggressiveness, trait aggression. So as people become more aggressive, or the people who are the most aggressive, their level of moral disengagement is a significant predictor of their attitudes about political violence. But people who are not aggressive at all, there is no real relationship between moral disengagement and violence for them. So it does seem like aggressiveness is playing an important role in even connecting these attitudes of moral disengagement and violent attitudes. We also tried to make this into somewhat real world, right? This is the critique we often get, is that aren't these just expressive responses? People don't actually participate in violence. And that's true. Most people don't participate in violence. And we still think it's important, even if they are expressive responses, to understand, what is the percentage of people out there who is maybe not discouraging their friends from engaging in violence. But we also tried a few things that were kind of like in the real world, including a noise blast experiment where we had people assign the level of decibels that would be a punishment for getting a question wrong in a quiz. And we told them the characteristics of the person who would be getting that punishment, and including their partisanship. And what we found is that when the person with the headphones on was a Republican, Republicans were much more likely than Democrats to choose low levels of decibels, including the highest level, we say it's like actually extremely painful. And the lowest level, we say it's like a washing machine. So when it's a Republican target, Republicans choose the lower levels. When it's a Democratic target, Democrats slightly choose the lower levels. And when we get up to the very painful levels of noise, we see for the Republican target, Democrats seem to be choosing more of the painful targets for the Republican and less for the Democrats, and vice versa with Republicans. So this is sort of an indication that perhaps this is actually part of some real world decision making when we talk about harming other people. We also tried to use real world examples. So this is using the examples of Gabby Giffords, the shootings of Gabby Giffords and Steve Scalise, and having people, recall these events and then asking sort of how bad was this event. This is just the percentage of people who said anything that was, less bad than very bad. And what we see here, again, is that there is a partisan effect where Democrats are, considering the Scalise shooting as somewhat less bad than the Giffords shooting, and vice versa for Republicans. They're finding that the Giffords shooting is somewhat less bad than the Scalise shooting. So when it comes to actual harm to real people, we also see this partisan bias towards violence in sort of directing it towards people in the other party rather than in your own party. And then finally, one thing that we're noticing is that it does seem like there are, we know that there are diverging trends on attitudes about equality in the electorate, particularly with the racial resentment scale. I'm guessing everyone is familiar with the racial resentment scale, but just this is, Irish, Italians, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any favors. This is not in the book, but we describe this trend in the book, which is that over the last few decades, Democrats have become a lot more racially progressive and Republicans have not. On the racial resentment scale, this is credit to Ian Shapiro at the Brennan Center. And so what we noticed in our data was that levels of racial resentment predicted higher levels of moral disengagement among Republicans who were the highest in racial resentment. And for Republicans, that's this line here. For Republicans, those highest in racial resentment were most likely to be morally disengaged from Democrats, and those lowest in racial resentment were the least likely to be morally disengaged from Democrats. So it does seem like there's a real cross pressure here for low racial resentment Republicans. And there's a similar but not as strong effect for Democrats, where the Democrats who are the most morally disengaged from Republicans are the ones who are the lowest in racial resentment. So suggesting that there is something about this fight over racial equality that seems to be motivating our assessments of people in the other party as threatening and or less than human. We also find this for hostile sexism only among Republicans, though, where the Republicans who are the highest in hostile sexism are also the most dehumanizing and vilifying of Democrats. And those who are the lowest in hostile sexism are actually quite, comparatively quite tolerant of Democrats. Because it is acting as a cross pressure, we think, where the average scores in the sample of Democrats and Republicans are quite different. And then we do try to look at, in the book, we try to look at, are there ways for us to reduce these violent attitudes? We've continued to look at this after the publication of the book, if you have questions about that. But for the purposes of the book, we know that elites have influence on people. We know that, through the January 6th hearings, that Trump had was using a lot of sort of pro-violence rhetoric. Biden himself on January 6th made this clear. He said, the words of a president matter. They can, at their worst, they can incite. And so we did a quick experiment, or a couple repeated experiment, looking at how just hearing a message from Joe Biden or Donald Trump can increase or decrease approval of violence. And so some people saw Donald Trump said, I condemn all acts of violence. These are real quotes from different periods of time. Joe Biden said, violence is never acceptable. Pretty weak manipulations, honestly, interventions, as far as interventions go, just reading one or two sentences from one or the other leader, or having a control group that didn't read anything. And what we found actually was that those who read the anti-violence message did approve of violence less than people who did not read any message at all, across these two surveys. So it does seem like simply hearing from a leader as a reminder that you shouldn't be violent, you shouldn't like violence. This is not a good way to do democracy. It is important to see what our elected officials are saying, because they do seem to really, really matter. And I'll note here, this didn't matter whether Trump or Biden said the message. It seems that people who read the message from either their own leader or the opposing party's leader backed off, either because they were being loyal to their leader or because hearing the opposing party's leader say something against violence actually became less of a threat for them, right? It seemed less like the other party is going to engage in violence imminently. And so they didn't have to approve of violence quite so much. I'm running out of time, I think, Nathan. I want to make sure that you have time. All right, I'll just do a few takeaways that we talk about from the book. The pessimistic case is definitely more fulsome in our explanations. we have, as I've looked at in other research, there, we have social sorting going on. So the alignment of our partisanship with race and religion, and sex and gender suggest that it's hard for us to get out of this. We have all of these aligning identities that are working behind this. In other countries, these types of relationships between partisanship and other important social cleavages tend to increase the possibility of violence and/or civil war. The last time our parties did this, and especially in terms of racial attitudes, or attitudes about racial equality and racial identity, was during the period when we had the American Civil War. And the last time we had major racial justice efforts in the US during the 50s and 60s, that was a time of great social upheaval and a lot of political violence, including assassinations. It's just that those were not aligned along partisan lines at that period of time. So it didn't become a partisan battle exactly. We also, there's implications for democracy. Republicans now are sort of like made up of the three most dominant factions of social identity: Christian, white, and male. We know that people, as they lose power, the dominant groups who lose power, don't react well to that in society. It's very difficult for a society to go from particularly like an ethnic majority to have that ethnic majority turn into an ethnic minority, which is what we're going to see in the next few decades in the US with whites. That creates a lot of resentment. And our systems, our institutions give that shrinking faction of Americans much more political power than they would get because they happen to be in rural areas, which are privileged, according to our institutions. And because these local places or state-based politics exist, we have increasing power among traditionally high-status social groups aligned with the Republican Party, in power in these places. Because of our federal system, they have the ability to really enforce their will. I was supposed to put that up earlier, sorry. This is just comparative work showing that in a study of 100 other countries, when politics is cross-cut by class, region, ethnicity, there's a lower chance of civil war. But this is our optimistic case. Progress never happens without some kind of resistance, right? Power doesn't give itself up. And every time we've seen sort of movements toward more political power for traditionally marginalized groups, we have seen organized opposition to it and even violent opposition to it. And so the possibility here is that we are on sort of the bumpy part of the road to a more multi-ethnic pluralistic democracy. And we're going through this inevitable stage of how do you get through the backlash? How do you get through the opposition to increasing pluralism, increasing equality? There is no way to go through that process without opposition. So are we just in that moment, or is this the end of the road and the backlash will be victorious? We just don't know the answer to that. But on that note, I will hand it over to Nathan and stop.
Absolutely. Right. Pull up this. Let's go here. Okay. Can you see my slides okay?
Sure can. Thanks.
All right, great. So I'm going to recognize that you all are survey experts and probably want to see a little bit under the hood and get a broader sense of what's going on with these measurements. We're actually writing a best practices methods paper that we'd like to get into POQ if we're able, on measuring public views on political violence. So this is some snapshots from that. I'm going to go really fast because we don't have a ton of time. History of measurement, guiding principles, measurement frameworks, reducing measurement error, structural features of questions and surveys, context and interventions, and a few comments on our critics from Palo Alto. We did a search of Roper's IPOL database for questions related to violence with a number of search terms. We actually came up with a number of hits that we didn't know at the time that we were doing our book. lots of questions that were asked. These aren't hundreds of questions. These are a couple dozen questions, but nonetheless an interesting history of both commercial organizations as well as academics like NORC putting out questions, sometimes having surveys with many questions about social and political violence. Often sporadic, following specific violent events. Some of the topics include a focus on racial justice, anti-abortion, Oklahoma City bombing, religiously motivated terrorism, and the recent attack on the Capitol. First general question about is violence okay against government was by Gallup in 1970. Almost none of them give a definition of what they mean by violence or list specific actions. Most are closed-ended. Most include a don't know option. And they generally followed whatever was the most common mode of surveys at the time, from in-person to phone to online. Here's some principles. Sorry for all the text. The big question for researchers is not if people support political violence, but when. That we've found there isn't one true level of violence to find in terms of people support. It all depends on the details and the social norms, whether you're going to see almost no support or almost total support for political violence. An example of this is 80% of Americans support the citizen violence of the American Revolution. That's not surprising to us, but that's political violence against government. And so there are at least some circumstances where almost everybody will say that violence is okay. And yet the same people who say that that's okay are mostly not endorsing violence by their own party at the same time. General questions still have value, even though support is highly conditional on the details. General violence attitudes can be useful as a proxy, as I'll show in a second. And sometimes specific details can actually be too narrow for the purposes that we might have. All measures are imprecise, with wording and inattention and social desirability. It's good to try to come up with creative design fixes to the extent you can, and interpret cautiously, and to take top lines with a grain of salt. The best approach is to ask an array of questions across different kinds of formats to get the fullest portrait of people's violent attitudes, just like any other topic in public opinion research. There's not one silver bullet question that's the right question or the clearest question. Violence is subject to weak and minimal attitudes, just like a lot of other topics that we study, but still yields meaningful responses. Sample quality matters. I'll say more about that later. And attitudes aren't behaviors. So the lack of widespread violence doesn't rule out the possibility of large numbers of people having violent attitudes. We know that from psychology. Attitudes are not the same as actions. So when you're writing these kinds of questions, you want to think about what kind of details you want to include or not. Some important aspects are: who are the aggressors, who are the targets, what are the provocations, and to what degree, what kind of violence are we talking about? Generally, the term violence is ambiguous, and the more specific harms, the stronger the harm, the worse it is, the less people support it. That's kind of as we would expect. When we do ask questions about violence without defining it, the level of support looks similar to levels of support for property damage or fistfights, and not like the levels of support for lethal violence, which is lower. Responses tend not to be highly constrained or well considered. So 37% of the whole population says that violence against government is never justified, and they say that the US Revolution was justified. So they're not putting things together, just like on lots of topics. And that we need to be careful when we're interpreting questions that include ideological motives, like Larry Bartels asking questions of Republicans on whether violence to save traditional ways of American life are appropriate. We need to see how all of those pieces are affecting responses. This is a comparison of the general partisan violence today question and a bunch of more specific questions. And I think it shows that the general question can be useful as a proxy for a lot of more specific views. In the full sample, the correlations between the general and specific questions are between 0.5 and 0.67. If you restrict it by excluding the quarter of the sample that's failing an attention check, which we think is a reasonable approach, the correlations drop somewhat, but are still substantial for a number of those items. As I said, we think attention checks are good to help interpret, but also we need to be careful not to make them too hard. An example of this is that some of our critics had vignettes that they mislabeled in their appendix. They put the wrong state names associated with each vignette. That's not a big deal. It's easy a mistake to make, but this was actually used in the attention check that they had in their paper, and so they were effectively failing their own attention check. So there are some people who are giving substantive responses that if you make the attention check too hard, you're going to be throwing them out when you shouldn't. Conditioning on survey attention doesn't always make a big difference. It almost always reduces levels of support, but not dramatically. You can see that in the chart on the top right, the table. We asked a bunch of specific questions whether people thought violence would be okay under those circumstances. You see in parentheses, the attentive people are always a little bit lower than, or almost always a little bit lower than the full sample, but these are not dramatically different. States United did a study where they filtered both an attention check and an expressive responding question, like one that Lily and I use, and found that it decreases levels of support to about 70% of the full sample. I should say our attention check that we've used recently is asking people a question about whether fistfights are okay, which is a weird question, and then immediately asking them in the next question, what did we just ask about, with 5 multiple choice options, and fistfights is the answer, and a quarter of people in YouGov surveys get that wrong, which was surprising to us. We have to think about social desirability as something that could actually decrease levels of actual support reported in surveys, as well as the potential for expressiveness that doesn't have substance behind it that could be overstating. I'll skip over that a little bit. You can use various methods to try to get at falsification through social desirability, and some studies do show that violence is a little bit higher among people when they're given a chance to obscure their views than when they have to state them directly. Sample quality matters. There's online panels of all sorts that are differing in quality, and generally higher quality panels like YouGov tend to show much lower levels of violent support than others. An example of this, I won't go into all the details. We were associated with some co-authors who provided UCLA Nationscape data that was based on lucid samples. We published some work in Politico. We tried to make a point of not comparing YouGov and lucid data directly, but unbeknownst to us, more direct comparisons were made in this publication, and it made it look like violence support had jumped from 15% to 30% within the year leading up to the election, which was terrifying. Subsequent evidence showed that YouGov numbers were basically flat through that same time, while the lucid numbers increasingly diverged from the YouGov numbers. And so we regard the YouGov numbers as higher quality than the lucid numbers. So that was embarrassing for us. This partly motivated some of our main critics to begin writing their critiques. Their first draft said our measures with YouGov overstated violence support, but their estimates that they reported in that paper were actually higher than the ones that we were giving, because they were using Qualtrics panel data. And when their final article came out, they added YouGov data, which showed lower levels than their Qualtrics data. So that is additional support. Another question is, should you include don't knows or not? This is from the Roper survey. The vast majority of questions that included don't knows actually collected very few people, single digits, who chose don't know as opposed to giving a substantive response. And the couple of exceptions tended to be situations where it was a very specific incident, and knowledge of that incident would probably be low. And so it was less about whether violence is okay or not, and more about just not being aware of the incident. Whether you should use balanced or unbalanced scales, we don't have a clear answer on this. You can go, I think there's good reason to go either way. The results do look somewhat different depending on whether the scales are balanced or not. but it's not clear that one is better than the other. You can do a branching format where you just ask a yes, no initially and follow that up with additional questions to gauge levels. For threats, it doesn't seem to make much difference. For evaluating violence, maybe a little bit more so. The last things I wanted to mention, actually, these are similar to what Lily has already said. Contentious times yield more support for threats and violence. Immediately after violence can also do the same. Elections are contentious times. We think it's important to test what reduces violent views and acts as well as what makes things worse, to think about bystander interventions. Some kinds of interventions are easier to do than others, and measuring social influence is particularly hard, even though we think it's one of the key factors that shapes people's attitudes and behaviors. And that we need to do more to study the link from violent attitudes to intent, to act, to action, and not forget about that threats are forms of violence, and there's tens of thousands of threats that are being made every year at all levels of government. I won't get into this too much because I kind of touched on some of it. I'm happy to talk more about the Westwood article in PNAS. Shanto Angar recently wrote a review in Presidential Studies Quarterly, and Jack Lee wrote in POQ this year. She was generally more positive than the others. I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions.
That was terrific. Thank you so much. So we're now open for questions. Feel free to turn on your camera if you're comfortable. I can call on you, or you can just start talking. That's great. And please start with your name and affiliation before asking a question or contributing to the discussion. And as the moderator, I feel like I get the pleasure of going first, if you don't mind. So I found myself thinking as I was reading your book that your work deals with potentially traumatic topics. Like, these are pretty heavy, pretty deep topics. And I've been thinking a lot about survey-inflicted trauma. And what are you doing? What do you do for yourself and for those, I'm assuming you're working with graduate students and others. What do you do for yourself and others to try to keep yourself safe when working with such a sensitive topic?
That's a great question. I think in the survey context, we've done less. We provide some within survey warnings about upcoming content that's going to be pretty intense. We don't do a lot in the way of debriefing within that context. I'll say that the political threats article that we just wrote talks more about managing those human subjects challenges and research challenges when interviewing people who have received threats, particularly public officials, and when doing content analysis of threatening materials that research teams need to think about how they protect themselves in those cases. So in that context where it's really apparent that this isn't your usual social science topic or survey, we've thought a lot more about it in that context, but have not done as much for these particular surveys. I'll say that it is a heavy topic, and Lily, do you want to talk about how we try to manage that? Or
well, I think first of all, it's important to note that we're looking at regular people. These are not militia members. These are not the people who are calling election workers, probably. I don't think there's a lot of militia members in the YouGov panel, at least. But so to the extent that it's difficult to process, I think it's easier to process than I think, I've worked with a lot of people, like at the SPLC, and people who are really in like dark corners of the internet. And and for that type of research, I think it's just absolutely necessary to have like mental health counseling as part of the funding for the program. Like it's just, it has to be part of it. But for this, I actually feel more like we are sort of like keep taking the pulse of a country that is already sick and might get sicker. And one thing that I think that Nathan and I both felt during right after, or actually lead up to January 6th, before the book came out, was that we had suspicion, like we were like, things look bad in our data, but there was no way for us to like get that information. Like that's why we put out like op-eds, and that's why we, participated in public facing work. But so to the extent that we can keep doing this and be able to report like, this is what's happening, this is the pulse, I think that actually for me feels more safe to be able to at least know what's happening in the public.
Thank you both. Yeah. Diane, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Melissa. And I arrived a little bit late from another session, but I'm very interested in the statistics that Nathan presented. And sorry, I haven't read the book, but I was wondering about the survey questions themselves and what kind of research or cognitive testing was done, prior to or even any cognitive testing that was done with the questions that you were using in the survey work.
So YouGov does their own cognitive testing just to make sure that people are understanding the question. We didn't ask them to do any kind of specific cognitive testing to dig into what people were thinking, but that's part of the reason why we have so many follow-up questions, elaborating specific political conditions, specific types of violence, the scope of violence that would be acceptable, wording our questions in like a lot of different ways to see if people will react differently, question the response order, that's sort of why we put so many versions of all these questions in there, to see how much does this change across all these different contexts and wordings.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is an investigation into the or what you're talking about is an investigation into the interpretation of the questions by having multiple versions of the question to see if that impacted your actual responses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is largely a descriptive project. It's just these questions have not been out there. And so we didn't know until 2017 what most Americans thought about these things when we first started measuring it. And so for us, it was very much a descriptive project to sort of figure out, like, what do these items do? Like, are we actually getting a sincere response from people? And what, under what conditions are they going to answer, more violently than others? And we found that there was a lot of room, but it never got rid of the, self-reported approval of violence altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And I have one more follow-up, hopefully quickly, that in terms of one of the things that I worry about is sort of the I guess the underlying context that that respondents have. I mean, what is the concept that you're trying to measure? And so what are respondents that we as the professionals have a different, perhaps have a different meaning to those words or those concepts than what the average everyday respondent does. And so that I'm very interested in having that kind of pre-research on, are we asking the question in a manner that respondents actually think about that phenomenon? So that if you have a reaction to that, it's just sort of a thought more than it is a question. Thanks, though. This was really, really cool.
Thank you. I could jump in on this. So a good illustration of this is the meaning of the term violence. Instead of doing pre-testing, we kind of just threw all of the the comparisons on into our main instruments. We started by asking people having endorsed at least some level of violence by their side, what they had in mind, and we first did it in an open-ended survey, so we could have them write whatever they wanted to clarify what they were thinking, and then we, in the later survey, we used those closed-ended questions to create, or sorry, open-ended questions to create closed-ended questions that corresponded with the categories of things that people were giving us. So we approached it from both directions, and we had a number of other questions that we asked as open-ended. So instead of sitting down with people and having them do a more traditional cognitive interview, we used open-endeds to try to do that to some extent on what people were thinking of about violence, about what kinds of things they think would justify violence, and a number of others that I'm not thinking of right now.
That sounds really good. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Hi, I was kind of hoping you guys could talk more about the attention checks and how kind of how that may have affected like weeding out people that we actually may want to hear from who are just not paying attention, or if you could just talk about that a little more. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for your question. So there's a number of ways that people have employed attention checks that you probably are familiar with. There's the kind of like choose two answers that don't make sense as a showing that you're paying attention, or a promise that you are going to be attentive, sometimes in combination. I mentioned that our critics said that they had them read a long vignette about an alleged violent event that happened in Oregon, and then at the end of that, they had to recall that it happened in Oregon. So not a substantial detail, but sort of a one on the side. And we were initially worried that kind of level of attention that people would miss that, but still give, on a short question, they would still give a valid answer. And we found that the attention check seemed to correlate with trait aggression, which made us worry that there are aggressive people who are maybe paying some attention, but not total attention, who are being excluded. The people who are inclined to be more likely to say that they approve of political violence are being systematically excluded. We used what we think is a better measure of that's more reasonable measure of attention, and still found a number of people failing, and we still find that there is a reduction in levels of support based on even that more reasonable attention check. So I think overall it's a good thing to include. It's possible that a single question is not perfectly separating the people who are and aren't attentive, but it's a reasonable thing to include. And our whole purpose was never to say exactly 14.68% of people approve of violence. Our research shows that it's a huge range that depends on the details, and so we wanted to identify, in general, is this nobody or is this a lot of people? And I think adjusting, having it be 70% the size versus 100% of the size estimated doesn't make a big difference. There might be some contexts where the implications are different, but we don't think it really changes the contribution of what we're putting forward.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, as Diane pointed out, I forgot to say, my name's Samantha Finley, and I work for the Employment Development Department in California.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys. This was great.
Yeah, and thank you to both of our guests today for joining us and participating in this series. thank you to all of you for making it a success. I want to be mindful of our time and use our resources smartly. So as promised, the attendee that won a copy of today's book is Grace Medley. I'll reach out to you shortly to get your details to send you a copy of the book, and congratulations. I want to take this opportunity. Yes! To plug that our next book club meeting will be on November 16th with the editors of the new report from the National Academies of Sciences toward a 21st century national data infrastructure, enhancing survey programs by using multiple data sources. You can sign up at our Eventbrite page, and we'll also send out an email to the listserv, and it's definitely going to be a really hot one, so make sure you're there. Stay tuned for information about the upcoming DC-AAPOR holiday party coming up on December 7th. Details to be announced soon. And I just want to thank everyone, thank our guests again, and cheers to a great afternoon. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having us.
All right.
Everybody.